Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so Joe Rogan had a little clip of his show go viral yesterday because of his conversation with Steve-O, where he went on this crazy transphobic rant, pretty much just at the mention of trans people. Kind of at the drop of a hat, Joe Rogan goes on this crazy rant. And the truth is, substantively, this is the same stuff he's been ranting about for a long time now. It's not that new. Really, what's different about this situation is that Steve-O clearly wasn't expecting as much pushback as Joe gives him to just this little cute story that he's trying to tell. And to be fair, the reason that Steve-O's talking about this is because he's considering getting a boob job for himself for no reason other than as a stunt, which is a little bizarre. I guess nothing really wrong with it. Probably a stupid idea. Seems like he's really desperate for attention at this point in his career, so he probably shouldn't do that. But he said, since he's been considering that, he saw a trans person, a person who was visibly trans, at the grocery store and asked them about it because he wanted to know more about their experience, etc. And the point of this story was to say that it gave him some new perspective, and he saw what they were saying. He heard some things that he hadn't heard before. It gave him some empathy, but pretty much right away, Joe Rogan cuts him off and goes on this crazy rant with all of these talking points. So I'm only highlighting this because, first of all, this hasn't stopped, this wave after wave after wave of this transphobic propaganda, which does end up getting people hurt and leading to horrible policy throughout the country. And also to really highlight the fact that Joe Rogan talks about this type of stuff to distract you from the other subjects that even his own audience wants to hear more about, like what the people currently in power are doing with their power and the Epstein files and whatnot. This is the stuff that Joe really cares about. He gets more animated about this than anything that he talked about with Trump or any of these politicians that he's had on his platform, like RFK Jr. recently. He doesn't push back on them about any subject as much as he pushed back on Steve-O here. So check that out.
And I'm buying groceries in the supermarket in LA, and the person ringing me up on the cash register is seems pretty evidently transgender. And I'm just like, dude, it's like the fucking universe is giving me signs over here, you know? And so like I ask this, didn't even occur to me up to this point that I need to like run it by anybody, because I'm like, fuck it, my body, my choice, who cares? You know, I'm doing a dumb stunt to like, you know, be crazy. But in this situation, talk to this transgender person, like, hey, can I run something by you? And I spoke with them. They described to me a level of oppression that genuinely fucking broke my heart. They said, hey, let me tell you, like, I am not allowed to use the bathroom at my own place of work. We've got like
That's not true. They're just not allowed to use the bathroom. It doesn't align with their biological sex.
Okay.
But you got to realize, they're not all, listen, I genuinely think there's people that feel like they are in the wrong biological sex.
Sure.
Right? But there's also people that are fucking perverts. And I'm not saying all trans people are creeps.
Right.
But a lot of these fucking people that are in trouble for going into women's bathrooms dressed as a woman with a fucking beard and a heart on are just that. They're creeps.
Right, okay.
They're crazy men.
Okay, well then I'll land on this.
Do you know who's killed more people than ICE this year? Trans shooters. Do you know the majority of these high school shootings have been transgender people?
I did not know that.
Yeah. Oh, how many of them? There was one recently, and yeah, it's a lot of them. I try to be kind to everyone, and if I meet someone who's trans, if they want me to call them Stacy or whatever, like, I know a couple trans people. My friend Jim Norton is married to a trans woman. Yeah. I'm super cool with them. Hug her every time I see her. I'm cool with that. Yeah. And if you want to have an all-gender bathroom, good luck with the legal ramifications of that if it's a bar, because then any guy can fucking go in there, and any guy and girl can be in if it's a multiple-stall bathroom.
Right.
But the solution is XY chromosome. And the solution is, like, if a guy walks into the men's room with a dress on and he's trans, just leave him alone. Leave them alone. Let them go to the bathroom. Like, what is the big deal? You can't, let's like, you can't have an open border. Doesn't mean that all immigrants are murderers, and you don't think that either, right?
I
but
don't.
some people that sneak across the border, if you don't check, are going to be murderers. It's just a fact.
Yeah.
So you have to have a fucking closed border to check, and you have to have a gender border too.
Yeah. Well, God damn it. And my only takeaway from my experience that I was relating to you is that it made me feel compassionate.
Well, that's
and
nice.
I want to be.
Yeah, so that's genuinely rough to listen to. Joe Rogan, especially when it comes to this particular issue and a few other issues like it, has really descended into madman territory. Unfortunately, this type of thought process has become a lot more normalized, and that's partially because of Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan has been talking like this for years. And the one thing that I've noticed in going through his content, usually with a pretty fine-tooth comb, trying to pick out the more important things that he says, is that his content is not to be underestimated in terms of just the sheer amount of shit that he throws out there. And you really see it with Steve-O here, where he kind of gish gallops is the term people were using for this a few years back. But basically you throw out a bunch of claims kind of at the same time, and if enough of it sounds true and your opponent doesn't know enough to fact check you on every single point, it kind of just puts them back on their heels. So that's exactly what happens with Steve-O here. And yeah, he could have, pushed back on this a little bit more, but he genuinely seems to not have expected that Joe would be so harsh about this, and thought that it would just be like a nice, cute little story. And so to go through a couple of these points here, he says this thing about transgender shooters have killed more people than ICE. So this is part of the emerging narrative that transgender shooters are responsible for all this death. You saw this immediately after Charlie Kirk was killed, even though that was like a tangential connection at best. And really, they want it to be true that all of the mass shooting violence is coming from trans people. That's not true. Mostly it's still coming from the same demographic, just like young white kids, white men, white boys. And there was no talk of this, especially not in a narrative sense, on the Joe Rogan platform throughout the last several years, where it has been consistently white nationalist violence. People going and shooting up black neighborhoods, black churches, immigrant communities, or just schools with these like white supremacists or weird screeds in their journals and stuff. That's the type of mass shooting violence we've seen consistently. But they want to take a smaller emerging trend of more transgender shooters in the past few years and turn that into the entire narrative. So he says this thing about transgender shooters have killed more people than ICE this year. That's a nice packaged, pretty clean little talking point there. So when you look into it, it seems like that's true, because ICE has killed on the records maybe 8 or 9 people, not accounting for the people that we don't know that have died behind closed doors, but getting back to that in a second. If you look at how many people have been killed by quote-unquote trans shooters, the number's about 11. But one of these cases, interestingly, happened within the last month. So this talking point has emerged within the last month, where there was a shooting by an 18-year-old transgender shooter that killed like 8 people. But that shooting happened in Canada. So why does that matter? Because ICE can only kill people in America. And if you look at the amount of people that have been killed by trans shooters in America, without that number from Canada, it's 2. So that's the type of dishonesty that is literally built into the Joe Rogan experience at this point. He probably hasn't even thought about this enough that he knows that, but the problem is he's just gathering all of these talking points. That's what he does in his spare time. He gathers up all these talking points and then he kind of fires them off at the audience. And that is really why I think Joe Rogan occupies so much space and has so many listeners, is because his podcast is not boring. Sometimes it's like more mundane conversation, but a lot of times it's these like very detailed screeds going in on these subjects and throwing all kinds of stuff out there. And honestly, all this stuff that he's saying, when you put it together, doesn't really make sense, because he starts off just reflexively saying that it's about the bathroom. You should have to go to the bathroom of your biological sex. And he says, I have empathy for people that are truly gender dysphoric, but then you have these other people that have this perversion. Again, that's not true. That's made up. They make up the idea that these horrible things happen, and then they talk about that endlessly. And if anything, that creates space for people who are right-leaning and who are being exposed to this type of stuff to do weird stunts to try to make a point. And so Joe says he supports people that have, gender dysphoria, people who are real trans people, in his opinion, and it's only these perverts that are the problem. But then when it comes to talking about prisons or talking about bathrooms, he's taking a hard line, saying you have to be with your biological sex, and that's the only way to keep people safe. But he's clearly in his mind, and he says repeatedly that he's talking about like a man in a dress, quote unquote, and not talking about all of the different types of trans people that might find themselves in this position. And he later references that he knows trans people like Jim Norton's wife, and he respects her. But then later, when talking about a trans person going to the bathroom, he says, so what if a dude in a dress has to go into the bathroom? Just leave him alone. Meaning a trans woman who is going to the men's bathroom. So he's saying in that case, just leave him alone. But in that case, he would be talking about the person that he referred to, Jim Norton's wife. That's not who he's saying in that example, but she would also be lumped in with that. And the reality is that makes trans women unsafe. The whole reason that that adjustment needed to be made in the first place, especially in the case of prisons, is that trans women are much less safe in men's prisons. That's just true. That's a documented fact. So while there might be some cases where the reverse is true and a man might try to get into women's prison instead by saying he's trans, that is something that shouldn't be allowed. But the vast majority of these cases are people who are genuinely trans. And so Joe is lumping all of them in with his solution to this imagined problem, that there are people who are getting assaulted, or that there are men walking into women's bathrooms in dresses all the time, and that that's a thing that's happening. It's not. They imagine it. It's a fever dream, a hallucination. And they want people talking about that, because the people who are genuinely in power right now are sending us to wars and covering up their own crimes when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein. And this obsession that Joe Rogan has with trans people is the reason that not only are we distracted by that, but we have let into the door the worst perpetrators of these pedophilic crimes against children. Joe is talking about creeps and weirdos. And meanwhile, a creep who is hiding documents about the FBI interviewing alleged victims of sex crimes by him. And that dude is sending us into a pointless war in Iran that anyone could have seen coming and nobody ever wanted. So that's what's happening with the people in power right now, with the people that Joe wanted to let into power, and with the people who were professing that they were solving this problem of trans insanity for Joe Rogan. They won. He got what he wanted, and they even did the executive order about only two sexes and all the laws that are being passed about this across the country. And this is really what people meant by punching down. You have the opportunity to really critique power. You have the ear of people in power, and you certainly have the ear of their base of support. But rather than do any type of criticism that tries to cut against that, you're actually going to use talking points like saying trans people are more dangerous to Americans, specifically, is what he was implying, than ICE. Even though the ICE murdering of 2 Americans and more people than that were in custody, as well as, again, the people that we don't know about. And in the case of trans shooters, there aren't going to be any deaths because of that are covered up by the government. These are shootings that get documented, that are done by random stochastic terrorists. But in the case of ICE, we know that if somebody dies on their watch and they're able to cover it up or not get it reported on, they're going to do that. They have the power to do that. So trying to paint a specific kind of mass shooting violence, which again is responsible for 2 deaths in America this year, not more than ICE, rather than the government institution that you help to empower. All it is just pure reactionary instinct. He's just trying to flesh out an inherent sense of disgust that he feels, again, not with people around him or people he knows, but an imagined version of what a trans person looks like, or what a fake trans creep could look like, as well as whatever garbage like that is being pushed to him on the algorithm. That's this mind state, and it's the mind state of a lot of Americans. And the answer is not to capitulate on this issue, but it is to remind people that this is absolutely disconnected from something that tangibly helps you. And the type of policy that is going to tangibly help everyone, including trans people, with their specified needs, as well as universal needs like healthcare and a place to live. Policy that addresses the universal needs of people is also ultimately going to be policy that addresses the individual needs of people through an expansion of who is considered to be human and worthy of that type of care by the state. It's the only solution for any of these problems, and these people are pointing at it over and over again because they see that the government is increasingly being weaponized against them, and that there are an increasing amount of problems that can only be accounted for by an accountable government. And the answer is not to keep taking funding away from the government, because we tried that way. We did Doge. We did the whole austerity politics thing. And all that happened is the money ends up going towards war. And now we've racked up more debt than we had before. It's a lie. We need to spend the money of government collectively addressing the problems of as many people as we possibly can. That's the answer. Investment in these problems is the only thing that's going to actually alleviate the pain and paranoia that Americans feel. And people like Joe Rogan and the conservatives that hide and sneak in behind him only get in the way of that, because their goal is to take money out of government. They don't want investment in any problem. They don't want a government that can address these things responsibly. They want a government that creates more problems than it started with, because that alone allows them to continue robbing people, and it allows private corporations to continue robbing people and taking the profit margin for themselves. And that's not the society that they want us to live in. That's the society we do live in. Joe Rogan helped facilitate that. We're there. And we can take this country back. And we do not have to capitulate to dumb talking points about trans people to do it. And regardless of what you think of him, Graham Plattner recently in an interview with some magazine gave a great answer on trans people, saying basically what I said, that this is a distraction from larger problems, but also that boys and girls wrestled together when he was coming up, and it was something that nobody cared about. And there are times when it's inappropriate and times when it's appropriate, and that's something that you scrutinize. Someone who's significantly bigger than you shouldn't be wrestling you. You can kind of solve the problem based on that logic. It's a minor issue that's being used to distract from the consolidation of power in this country. And as I've said before, the culture just has to shift away from this. People are going to become interested in other things. It's probably going to be impossible to convince people to get off of this particular hateful wavelength. And most of the time, people change their mind about things silently in their own space. And the culture just has to move on without them. And so that's the only answer ultimately at the end of all this. And that day will come eventually. And we just got to hang in there and not give up in the face of this gross. This is so gross. What a creep.
Me too close to, too much to do. The mission is too crucial. Shout it out from the rooftops until I lose vocals. Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity.